Hi, I'm Paul Van Auken. Today we're talking about the book, The Myth of Coequal Branches, Restoring the Constitution's Separation of Functions, with the author, David Siemers. So Dave, what in particular spurred you to write this book?
Well, as with a lot of academics, my previous research got me into it. So when I wrote my dissertation, my PhD dissertation in my first book, I was reading a lot of American founding material, so James Madison, the Federalist Papers, etc. And James Madison says in Federalist number 51 that the legislative branch in a republic is necessarily predominates. That is, it's the most powerful, it's the most directive force in government. And Alexander Hamilton says in Federalist number 78 that the judiciary is beyond compare the weakest of the three departments of government. And I thought that there's a bald contradiction here between how we talk about the government, that is, there are three co-equal branches of government, and how the founders thought about government, which is, in terms of power at the very least, there's Congress in the lead, and the judiciary is clearly the weakest branch. So I wanted to figure out how we got to the point where we're talking about the United States government in a way that's very different from the way that the founders thought about it.
According to your book, we Americans now have a widespread misunderstanding of the relationship between the three branches of government. Can you explain your argument?
Okay, the book is called The Myth of Coequal Branches, right? And the understanding or the idea is that the branches were never meant to be equal. And that's in fact a claim that the founders would find to be absurd. What they did is to set up a government with three different branches that would have three different functions. Okay, so Congress would have the primary job of making the law, and the president would have the primary job of executing that law written by Congress, and the judiciary would adjudicate disputes that occurred within the law. There was no sense that all three branches would be involved in everything that the government did, taking different positions against each other and kind of wrangling their way to solutions. In other words, we've been taught, typically in high school or in grade school even, that checks and balances are at the center of the American government. And that's an idea that would be foreign to the founders, the people who wrote the Constitution. They wanted to create an effective government. And the most important thing that you would do to create an effective government is you'd parcel out responsibilities to a set of people that was empowered and good at pursuing that function. So Congress needs to be representative. That's why they're drawn from all over the United States and elected, right? And the president needs to act with dispatch, right? Needs to execute the law quickly and effectively. That's why it's one person. And people who are in the judiciary need to be experts in the law. That's why we typically select people for lifetime terms and insulate them from politics who are experts in the law. It's that separation of functions that was the intent of the founders, rather than checking all over the place that leads to a kind of state of gridlock.
You've been talking about checks and balances, about co-equality, separation of functions, and the like. So in some ways, your book is about language. You even rooted in some of George Orwell's ideas about the connection between language and politics. Why did you want to write about that?
Well, we use language to convey meaning, and the words that we use are important. So if we use words that fundamentally mischaracterize what our government is about, that has a kind of significance. And it means that we somehow have internalized a corrupted view of what the American government is supposed to do or be like. So it's important to me to set the record straight. We say that there are three co-equal branches without even thinking about it. You hear this discourse all the time, whether it's from on the news, some news channel, or out of the mouths of a politician, or think tanks or interest groups use it all the time. And we have to pause, and every time we hear that, we have to think about what that means. Because in a way, it's a non sequitur. Power isn't like dog biscuits or poker chips. You can't simply quantify it. And it isn't the case that the president has an exact equal amount of power with the Congress. And even if that were true, what would that mean? I guess it would mean that the two would fight to a stalemate any time that they disagreed with each other. And that's just not the way that the system is set up. Some powers are given over to the president to do, even unilaterally, and some things are given to the Congress to do unilaterally. They do cooperate in certain things, especially in creating laws. The president is intentionally dealt into the legislative process. The president can veto laws, can suggest laws to Congress that they should make. But ultimately, there's no sense that the Congress and president are co-equal, and the judicial branch as well. So how we talk about these branches matters. And I want people to pause when they hear co-equal branches and give that a rethink, and to think more deeply about that phrase that's often blithely tossed about. Orwell says that bad language can corrupt thought. And in a way, I see that happening in the United States. Our lazy thinking about what our government is like is productive of a lot of dysfunction.
In this book, you basically did a lot of detective work, trying to get at where this all came from. And I'm wondering what you came up with. Was it like Orwell said, that if an idea is repeated enough, even if it's absurd, which is a word you used earlier, and it becomes thought of as the truth? Or how did Americans come to think that and say that the three branches of government are co-equal?
Well, it's a fascinating story, and that's what much of the book is about. How did this idea that was so contrary to what the founders thought, how did it become a kind of natural way of talking about American government? And it's relatively recent. In the 1950s, there was a senator from California named William Nowland. And for some reason, he used this idea and said over and over again that the branches were co-equals. And I guess it made some sort of sense in the post-FDR, post-New Deal world, where the president really clearly was a leader of the American government, that we recognize that by saying these branches are roughly co-equal. But Noland was a Republican, and for most of his time in the Senate, there were Democratic presidents, Harry Truman, his primary antagonist and rival. So why should Noland, this guy who's in Congress, the first branch of government, why should Noland say that they're equal? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but he did over and over and over again. And in the 1950s, if someone was saying that the branches were co-equal, it was William Noland, California senator. And by the end of the 1950s, other actors within Congress had picked that up. People like Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic leadership, essentially. And they repeated this regularly as a way of saying, we're relevant too, here with the Republican President Eisenhower. And so it became something that members of Congress said quite a bit during the 1960s. One of those people who was paying attention was Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon was Dwight Eisenhower's vice president. So during the 1950s, most of the 1950s, Richard Nixon is vice president of the United States. And he hears his old colleague, his fellow California senator. Richard Nixon was a senator from California in 1950, along with Noland, say this, and he internalizes that idea. And what idea does he use in Watergate to try to fend off congressional inquiries? He uses the idea that the presidency is a co-equal branch of government. So Richard Nixon in 1973 and 1974, through his lawyers, and he himself is saying, Congress, don't touch me. I'm co-equal. I'm a co-equal branch of government, and that means you can't investigate, you can't take my tapes, et cetera, et cetera. That ultimately failed before the Supreme Court, right? There's this big US versus Nixon Supreme Court decision which is adverse to Nixon, where he is ordered to divulge the tapes that he made in the Oval Office that might determine whether people engaged in criminal activity or not. He lost that battle, but he won the war over language. So in the wake of Nixon saying this, people came to say this on the Supreme Court. The New York Times, the Washington Post write this into articles. It becomes part of popular parlance. And Gerald Ford continues that. In 1974, his Republican Party is facing a midterm election massacre because of Watergate. And he says that the founders intended to have 3 co-equal branches of government. So you better vote for Republicans so the Democrats don't have a veto-proof majority in the House and the Senate. That was his way of pushing back against Democrats electorally. But this is how that idea came to our modern vocabulary, by people who were, by presidents who were speaking in times of weakness and duress for the presidency. They were trying to tout their own relevance and equality with Congress. And it's a fiction, but it's a fiction that the United States citizenry latched onto and repeated over and over. And that's why it is with us today. Even members of the Supreme Court use this on a regular basis, that the branches are co-equal. And my book explains that trajectory in quite a bit of depth.
So why is it so important for us to operate based on a more accurate view of the founders' intentions in this regard?
What's at stake is whether we have functional government or not. If we have a government that's set up to have different branches do different things, and instead of doing that, they all leap into the scrum and are fighting each other on every issue, you have a prescription for a dysfunctional gridlock government. And when you have dysfunctional gridlock government, what happens? Well, the result in the United States has been that the president, various presidents, have invented things that they can use to run the government unilaterally, right? So things like executive agreements. The Constitution sets up a process for agreeing with other countries. That's the treaty process. And the Senate was very intentionally involved in that. The Senate has to approve of treaties. But what happens when you have a dysfunctional government? The president simply bypasses the Congress and agrees to enter international agreements with other nations unilaterally by himself. And that's what Barack Obama did with the Paris Climate Accord. It's what he did with the Iran nuclear agreement. And it's what Donald Trump did to reverse those two things, or reverse American participation in those two agreements. We have a setup where those kinds of things are supposed to be so important that they involve multiple branches. And if they don't involve multiple branches, then the president himself runs a unilateral show. And in a variety of ways, from signing statements to executive orders to declaring states of emergency, the president has kind of taken over to attempt to work this government in ways that are unilateral and never intended. So one concern is that we have dysfunctional government, that the government doesn't work. And the second concern is that too much power is potentially being concentrated in one human being. And that's not the kind of government that any democracy should aspire to. So there are parallel concerns there, and when they work in tandem, it means that the president can't even pull off these unilateral things that the president is trying to do, whoever the president is at the time.
You mentioned how the idea of co-equality came up during the Nixon impeachment process, but the book starts with a vignette about the Clinton impeachment and the various arguments that were taking place there. Did you anticipate that your book might be circulating during another impeachment? What is the book's relevance to the Trump impeachment proceedings?
Well, I always tell my students that political scientists don't have a crystal ball. So, of course, I couldn't predict that there would be an impeachment at this particular time. But I think it says something that is relevant to the book. The founders gave Congress the ability to charge a president with high crimes and misdemeanors, essentially misuse of the office of the presidency, and to remove that person from office. That's an explicit power of the legislative branch. Meanwhile, the president cannot remove any single member of the legislative branch. So if you're thinking about co-equal branches, right there on its face, that's a contradiction with co-equality, right? So one branch can remove a president from office. The other branch can't remove a single member of the legislature. There is a huge power imbalance there, intentionally written into the Constitution so that the people's representatives could remove someone that they thought was abusing the office. What does this mean in the current environment? The current environment, of course, is fluid and developing. I'll say this, that anyone who claims that it's somehow illegitimate for the Congress to pursue impeachment or removal is saying something that is at odds with the Constitution. So they have every right to do that. That doesn't mean it should happen. It just means that Congress has been given that power very intentionally as a way of making sure that the laws are faithfully executed.
What impact do you hope this book will make? At this point, is it possible for U.S. politics and popular understanding to shift back to what you see as the original intent of the separation of powers of the three branches? How do you envision this happening?
Yeah, that's a big question. I hope that readers of the book would take to heart that we have a government that was designed to be functional, and it can be. It can work. And so there's a lot of, I get in my classes that there's a lot of despair about the American government and the way that it's working. But if enough people pressure, say, Congress to actually do its job, and its primary job is to legislate, right? It needs to legislate. It's not just that presidents have claimed higher power than they otherwise would have in the Constitution. It's that Congress has willingly given the president power, right? So if we all know and understand and hold members of Congress accountable for doing their job, we'll have a better politics. Now, you mentioned the term original intent, and I want to distinguish my argument from original intent as it's understood as judges would decide a case on, for instance. Original intent for judges means something like this. If you've got a case about the Eighth Amendment and it's about cruel and unusual punishment, you look back to what the framers of that amendment and those who ratified it thought about what was cruel and unusual, and you take your cue from them. What was cruel and unusual punishment in 1792 or 1791 when that was a live issue in American politics and when it was ratified? And my approach is a lot different. The Constitution has to mean something. And it is an attempt at self-government, right? With the intent of the founders laid bare in the preamble of the Constitution to promote the general welfare, provide for the common defense, etc. And we have to have a government that actually can attempt that and succeed at pursuing those goals. And to the extent that we have a government that is a giant strum with all three branches being able to stop each other anytime that there's a disagreement, we don't have a functional government. So my hope is that by educating people about popular government and the differences of function between the branches, that we can promote a more functional understanding of how the government is to work, and we can hold our politicians more accountable for actually doing the work of government which is to benefit society. And that's ultimately the goal of the founders. They didn't primarily want a government that didn't work. They didn't primarily want a government that was checked and balanced. They primarily wanted a government that was better than the Articles of Confederation, that could do the job of government better than the Articles of Confederation. And that's what we potentially have in the Constitution. It's not a perfect system because no human system or government is, but it's our one best chance of achieving the goals of the preamble, and that is creating a better union.
So I just want to say thanks to the author, David Siemers, for coming to discuss the book with us, and I would encourage everyone to pick it up and learn more about the myth of co-equal branches. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for your interest.